Welcome to Personal Landscapes. I'm your host, Brian Murdoch. You can find links for today's episode and other conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. We all seem to feel the tug of a particular landscape. For some, it's the mountains. Other people love coastal geography, beaches, or jungles. And some are island-mains, those like Lawrence Durrell who are drawn to small islands. For me, it's always been the desert. I first set eyes on the desert by accident. I wanted to get away for Christmas during my last year of university, but like most students, I didn't have any money. A close childhood friend from my hometown was living in Arizona at the time. I didn't want to go to Arizona. I visited him in Florida years earlier, and that seemed like a much better winter escape. But it was a free place to stay, so I went. I was hooked the moment I stepped off the plane. There was something otherworldly about the barren rocky hills and the cactus and the vast empty flats that connected them. I borrowed his car and I went driving all over the state that Christmas, stopping to hike red rocks and canyons and exploring Anasazi ruins. And I loved it so much I went back for more as soon as the school year was over. I would go on to travel many more desert places over the years. The Taklamakan in China, the Gobi in Mongolia, Namibia, and the deserts of Syria and Jordan. But my most memorable desert journeys were to the Central Sahara. That's what I want to share with you today. Not the story of my own desert travels, but the story of the Sahara. If you think the world's largest desert is an empty wasteland, you're in for a surprise. You'll be amazed at its geographic and cultural diversity, at the empires that rose and fell there, at the vast network of trading routes that connected the Mediterranean world to sub-Saharan Africa, and its many stories of exploration and travel. I'm joined by Eamonn Gearon, the noted Arabist, policy analyst, and author of a wonderful cultural history of the Sahara. He's an absolute encyclopedia of this fascinating region. We talked about desert whales, fossil water, astonishing rock art older than history, and a few of the travelers who explored this vast region and returned to tell the tale. I hope you enjoy our conversation, and I hope one day that you'll have the opportunity to experience desert places for yourself. Okay, so I think we should start by situating unfamiliar readers with a geographical overview of the Sahara. So when we talk about the Sahara, what are we looking at in terms of the current map of nation states?
It's really interesting, isn't it, that Sahara, a bit like Amazon, is one of those words that you kind of know long before you go to school. You don't have to be educated to understand that this is a really big place. I think what people don't realize is just how big it is. And whenever I'm talking about the Sahara, whether about, my own book on the subject or more generally, I tell people to look at a satellite image of the northern half of the African continent and all of the yellow bits of the Sahara. And they say, oh, yes, I see that. And I'll go through the countries in a second. But what I then tell people to imagine, particularly works well with American audiences, is that if you took all of the United States, and we have to include tiny Hawaii and mighty Alaska in that all 50 states fit inside the Sahara. There's a bit of room around the edge. And then you get people going, wow, it's enormous. At its widest point, east to west, it's about the same difference as it is across continental US. So, East Coast to West Coast, or sailing from Southampton in England to New York City, all of that great Atlantic Ocean is the width of the Sahara at its greatest extent. So those things, I think, give it a sense of the absolutely enormous scale of the place. In terms of modern day countries, then I think the one that's best known to people would be Egypt in the northeast corner, with the River Nile perhaps denoting its eastern boundary, or if you want to be a purist, it's the same desert, beyond the Nile. So Egypt there, and then to Egypt's west, we travel along the northern coast of Africa, the southern Mediterranean, and you have Libya next door, and then Tunisia tucked in between Libya and Algeria. Algeria now Africa's largest country since 2011, actually, when Sudan and South Sudan split. And then next to Algeria in the northwest corner of continental Africa is Morocco. And right below Morocco, as I put it, is the disputed territory of Western Sahara. I say as I put it because Morocco claims the land of Western Sahara as integral to its own nation state. That is a matter of some dispute, with the vast majority of countries in the world not recognizing Morocco's claim to it. So that's, a problem that's to be decided or to be determined in due course. Below Egypt, of course, if we knock the typewriter back to the other side, the barrel, right below Egypt, you got Sudan, again, which is a massive country and unfortunately in the news a bit these days for the wrong reasons. And then the other countries, which are far less well known, I think, to most Western writers, observers, are Chad, below Libya, and then we go Niger, Mali, Mauritania. And that's pretty much it.
This vast region is far from monolithic. I mean, the typical cartoon picture of desert landscapes is like a vast hell of sand dunes and a guy crawling out of it croaking, water, water. Give us a sense of the Sahara's physical geography.
I will certainly. Your reference there does remind me, if I may, without reaching copyright, it's a New Yorker cartoon that came out many years ago, which, as a desert lover, I collect all these sort of things and squirrel them away. There's a man crawling across that very same landscape you talk about, the endless sand dunes, and he's sweating profusely and calling out, water, water, and a little slice of pie. Which, whatever else, I think captures New Yorker cartoons perfectly. Of course, there are sand dunes in the Sahara. That's what we imagine the Sahara to be. But imagine, just to remind ourselves again, it's the size of the United States of America. But geographically, only 15%, that is 15% of that great desert is sand dunes. They're not all in one area. There's an enormous area of dunes called the Great Sand Sea, which straddles the borders of Egypt, Libya, and a bit of Sudan. There are other massive areas of dunes in Algeria, southern Algeria in particular. But it's odd to think when I say only 15% of the Sahara consists of dunes, that is an area about the size of Western Europe, right? So we're talking about Spain, Portugal, France, Britain, Switzerland, all of these places spread at different points throughout the northern half of Africa are these areas of sand seas, if you like. Another 15% is mountains. And I don't mean mountains of sand, but actual, honest to goodness rock mountains, many of which peaks have never been, to our knowledge, conquered or climbed by anyone because they're so remote and they are so rugged. I mean, once upon a time, perhaps, we'll maybe get into prehistory in due course, but if you went back, there were populations living in areas which today are completely inhospitable. But I think back in the day, people had a lot less leisure time for mountaineering. So I think it's safe to say that many of these places are still unclimbed, particularly in areas that are today unstable or politically dangerous. There are active bands of smugglers and terrorists and other groups that you don't want to run across operating in much of the Sahara. And some of the most exciting mountains are those in Algeria, which has problems with these lawless groups. So not the sort of place you want to go to. And that leaves 70% of the Great Desert, which is largely made up of not entirely, but almost completely featureless limestone plains. So you can imagine walking 100, 200, 300 miles in a straight line with just a little bit of undulation of the earth below your feet. And that, it doesn't sound very inspiring, but that's the sort of desert that I ranged over most when I was engaged on my own exploration of the Libyan desert, now in the last century, which seems odd to say. Yeah, so there's your geography. And of course, oases. I didn't mention the oases, but there are pockets of water throughout. And where you have oases, then you can have human life supported.
Yeah, surprising just how much water lies beneath a region that we think of as the world's driest.
Yeah.
So what is fossil water?
It's a funny term, isn't it? Fossil water. Well, as the name suggests, it's ancient. I think that's the first thing that it suggests. And fossil water exists below a great deal, not all of the Sahara, but a great deal of the Sahara. Libya perhaps has some of the greatest deposits of this so-called fossil water. And they live in what geographers call aquifers. Indeed, what are aquifers? And if you can imagine a rather hardy or tough sponge, not the sort of thing you'd want to take into the bath or shower with you, but this sponge that holds this water, we are able now, with technology, to drill down and suck out some of this fossil water. Now, another reason it's called fossil water, apart from the fact that it's very ancient, is that this is a non-renewable form of water. So all well and good, perhaps, for a farmer that has access to a pump to drill down and say, great, now I can have 10 hectares instead of 1. Alas, what happens when we go industrial is that they are sucking out water which cannot be replaced. It's not replaced by rainwater. It's not replaced by snow melt, as you would imagine with other sources of water in other parts of the country. And one of the biggest project, in fact, took place in Libya during the time of Colonel Gaddafi's reign, his 42 years in control of Libya. And he instituted something called the Great Man-Made River Project, which he wanted to see as the modern, one of the wonders of the modern world. And he had his engineers drill down and pump water vast distances, hundreds of miles up to the coast, to Benghazi, to Tripoli and other parts of the north coast where the biggest populations lie. It wasn't entirely successful. Wrong pipes, water pressure, lots of technical issues, but also, of course, they simply didn't need this amount of water because the population of Libya was not so great. And a big problem they had was that once they pumped all the water up and piped it to the northern parts of Libya, it sat in enormous reservoirs, which were then, of course, subject to heat and evaporation. So it's just a complete loss.
What's the state of that today? Is that still going on? Are they still pumping vast quantities?
Do you know, I don't know today. It's been a few years since I was in Libya. I haven't been back, actually, since the Arab uprisings, or so-called Arab Spring, which it's remarkable to think is now 11, 12 years ago. I must look into that. I don't know, to be honest, Brian.
So do populated regions in the desert map onto these aquifers?
Where the population centers are in the Sahara is obviously where water bubbles up. So there are two things at play here. You have the aquifers, which is nature's way of storing this water underground. And then you have fissures in the ground where water bubbles up. So, for example, a long time in my lifetime, that is to say, not hundreds of years ago, I used to live in an oasis in Egypt called Siwa, S-I-W-A. And I mention it quite a bit in the book. It's a place that Alexander the Great visited, and it's a beautiful place, not far from the Libyan border. And I was based down there for a while. Now, when you hear oasis, you might imagine, half a dozen palm trees and a body of water, perhaps the size of a bathtub or a garden shed. But actually, the oasis of Siwa consists of about 200 natural springs spread over a large area, and is able to support, at last census, a population in excess of 20,000 people. So this is not, your palm-fringed desert oasis of beau geste fame or romance. They can be really big areas. Of course, if they're small, very small, and they're not spring-fed, then they would evaporate. So a lot of this is just natural bubbling up of water. And there, where you find those across the desert, you'll find people.
And this is a date palm plantation type of place? Is that the economy of Siwa? Now that the Oracle is no longer functioning?
The Oracle is no longer functioning. Yeah, for people who don't know or never knew, the Oracle at Siwa was the sister Oracle of Delphi or Delphi in Greece, which is much more famous, of course, to Western audiences. And the Oracle in Siwa was able to, according to legend, according to belief, according to the faith of those who followed the religion of the time, was able to look into the future. So the story goes that Alexander the Great arrives in Egypt and is keen to conquer the country, but to do so as efficiently as possible. Being a great military strategist, and you might also think of this as an early example of military intelligence at work, according to his chroniclers, Alexander the Great sets off with a small body of men, by some accounts only a dozen people, and they march the 150 miles across the desert from the Mediterranean coast to Siwa. And on entering the oasis, he's greeted by one of the priests from the oracle temple, who comes out saying, "Greetings, Amun," basically recognizing him as the new pharaoh of Egypt. And in that moment of recognition, there are no pitched battles in Egypt, because if the priestly class have anointed you as the successor to the Greek pharaoh, the ancient Egyptian pharaohs, then this new Macedonian Greek man is in charge of the country. And that's exactly what happened. And Alexander the Great then was free to march with his armies eastward and on towards Persia, and a much more bruising encounter with another ancient civilization. But yeah, it was the oracle at Siwa that anointed Alexander the Great as the new pharaoh. And after Alexander's death, you have his successor Ptolemy. And so the whole Ptolemies, the Ptolemaic reign of several hundred years in Egypt, are all successors from Alexander the Great, not by blood, but first by anointment and then through their lines.
Are there any traces of the oracle today, the oracle temple?
There certainly are, yeah. No, Siwa was a wonderful place. The digression meant that I forgot to tell about the economy, which you asked me. Yeah, it's essentially date palms. I mean, by some accounts, 1 million date palms across this enormous oasis area, and olives too. And I have to say that Siwa is famous in Egypt and beyond for its olives. And I have to say, I didn't like them at all. I don't know, maybe I'm spoilt by Kalamata, or the brine they use just was never to my taste. So I always felt a bit sorry that one of its main economic outputs was something I found very, very bitter, the olives. But the dates are fantastic. So dates and olives, and unlike many farmers in other parts of the world, particularly those working with livestock, if you're working as a farmer with dates and olives, you got a pretty easy run of it. You don't have to be up at dawn to milk them. And the dates basically grow in the trees. And when it's harvest time, you send up somebody with a knife and they cut them down. There's a lot of time for sitting around thinking, which is just as well in the desert, because it is damned hot there. Remnants of the Oracle Temple. Yeah, there are, absolutely. And it's relatively easy to get to now. I mean, when I first traveled there, it was a pretty arduous journey, but now I understand you can get there by air-conditioned bus to Siwa. And lots of Egyptians go there when it's time for their holidays. There are religious festivals across the Muslim majority world, and the Eid is the name for the holiday that follows some of these. And during the Eid, of which there are two main Eids or holidays, festivals in the Muslim calendar, Siwa becomes overrun with Egyptian tourists going there, both to swim in the pools, to go shopping for dates, to take dune buggies and pootle around in the desert, all those sorts of things that tourists everywhere else in the world do when confronted with massive sand dunes and cool, refreshing water. But the remnants of the temple are still there, and well worth a visit if any of your listeners are in Egypt anytime.
So, speaking of of water in the desert and these farming oases, I want to talk about the Sahara's wet period. That's an area I find incredibly interesting, mostly for the remarkable profusion of rock art throughout the desert.
Yeah. My wife, whenever I start to talk and get onto the subject of rock art, my wife, Laura, does say, he's not going to go on about rock art again, is he? I find it endlessly fascinating, though, and I hope you'll allow me a 2-hour digression. No, just kidding.
Of course.
No, rock art, it's amazing, because I think in looking at rock art, I've been forced to address some of the prejudices that I inherited as a boy, and I think that's always kind of fun to be challenged. When we were growing up, the word that would have been used was primitive. And we were taught, I think, to imagine people that came a long time before us as primitive people because they didn't have motor cars, because they hadn't built the Sistine Chapel, and so on and so forth. What those people were was anything but primitive. And I really think we should sort of embrace the term prehistoric. So because we have no written records, it doesn't mean that their artistic output was any less remarkable, considered from the perspective of their time. And right across the Sahara, I mean, there are literally tens of thousands of individual artworks across the desert, across the Sahara, from Morocco to Egypt and south into Sudan and west again to Mali and Mauritania. And although the dating of rock art can be tricky, and it's certainly not an exact science, where we have dated it, we can see quite distinct periods from the very archaic, ancient hunter period, where you see generally male figures, or what are assumed to be male figures, with bows and arrows hunting. You see people, though, hunting out of the back of boats, so clearly on water. And now we're talking about places that might be 400, 500, 800 miles from standing water today. And there we have in the rock art evidence of hunters going after wildfowl, going after elephants, giraffe, hippopotamus, all in this, the world's largest hot desert. It's quite remarkable. But what's also interesting about the dating of rock art in the Sahara is that after the hunter period, we get the story of human history in the desert, because you have another phase which comes, which is pastoralism. And so it shows the shift from hunter-gatherer to agriculture. And then you have a lot more cattle appearing in the rock art. And that is interesting in and of itself. There are a couple of other main periods that specialist historians of rock art discuss, but the last one I would mention, and the most recent, is when you have camels appearing. I think that often makes people stop and say, what? Wait a minute, what do you mean the last one, the most recent? Well, the fact is that for all of the ideas we might have about the Middle East, the camel is a relatively recent import. And they weren't there throughout prehistory. And so the arrival of the camel in rock art it's interesting, because we can date it quite clearly as the most recent. And I'm talking by recent in the past 1,000 to 1,500 years, which in human terms is kind of remarkable too. Do you happen to know, Ryan, sorry to pose a question to you, you're the interviewer, but do you happen to know where the ancestor, the mother of all camels, came from?
Canada. I'm convinced it's Canada.
Well,
I know it's North America, but I would like to take credit for this.
It is. I'm just going to go apolitical and say it's North America. Yeah, the only continent today that doesn't have any camel species at all is where they all came from, some 50 million years ago. And if we think about how they spread around the world, before the Bering Strait opens up, of course, animals were free to roam widely. So what we call Asia today, they arrived there. But of course, in South America, we have llama and alpaca, which, even at a glance, you can say, oh, yeah, I can see how they're related with other species in evolution. It doesn't always strike you as obvious, but I think with the alpaca and llama, we can see that they are a camelid family quite easily. And then you have the two-humped camels in Asia, particularly Mongolian deserts, the Gobi, China. And then we have the single hump camel in the Middle East and North Africa. Another quick question. It's always a great pub quiz. There are two basic types of camels. I've mentioned them already. One with one hump and one with two.
Yeah. And
one is called a Bactrian and one is called a dromedary. And sometimes people, like me, put the question out there, and you can see audiences struggling. Which is which? I used to know this, they think.
Yeah.
Do you know how to tell the difference?
Well, ancient Bactria was in Asia, and I've traveled on both of them, so I've...
Yeah, but you see, you're obviously more educated than many, Ryan, because for a lot of people, they've never heard of Bactria and the famous gold Bactria. Do you know a much easier way of doing this? If everybody can picture two camels, one with one hump and one with two, and you know what cow tipping is, right?
Okay, well, I'm from Canada, yes. Rural Canada.
Think of camel tipping, all right? You got a one hump camel, tip it on its side, you have one hump for a letter D for dromedary. Two humps Bactrian for capital B. Now, you don't have to know about ancient Bactria or the wonderful gold they produced. You have one hump D for dromedary, two humps B for Bactrian. And
so when in doubt, just push it over.
There you go. If it ever comes up in a pub quiz, you're in the wrong pub.
So did the Bactrians morph into the one hump camel?
Correct. Yeah,
migration.
They're an older species. Yeah, they're also Bactrians, as you know. They're heavier. They have more fat on them. They are woollier. They have evolved to deal with the much colder climate. And once they move west, then the process of evolution means that the dromedaries are they have longer legs. For one thing, that keeps you further off the heat of the Earth's surface. That's one reason. They lose all of their shaggy hair, pretty much. I mean, camels, dromedaries still molt, but it's nothing like, you think of Mongolian camels, which are much more yak-like, big hairy beasts. Your dromedaries are a much sleeker animal for much hotter conditions.
Do you get wild camel populations in the Sahara as you do in the Gobi?
No, not really. No, the wild actually there's two main populations of wild camels in the world today. There's a few, and they're distinct species again of wild Bactrians, a wild camel, which is really interesting in Mongolia. If you see camels anywhere in the Sahara, they pretty much are owned by somebody. Mm-hmm. They might appear to be free range, but they belong to a farmer, I guess you'd have to call them, or a herdsman. The world's largest population of feral camels, though, another one that your listeners might be surprised to learn, it's in Australia.
Yeah, that's quite amazing.
Yeah, and they were taken there at the time that Australia was being opened up by the Europeans to help with road and rail construction. Didn't have any natural predators, and when the road and rail building was finished, they did what animals do when left alone, and the population grew and grew to, at last estimate I saw, was somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million wild camels. So they have an official cull in parts of Australia because they imagine they do a great deal of damage. So that's really interesting. In fact, there was some camels now are imported to Saudi Arabia from Australia because they're a much purer bloodline in Australia because they haven't been interbred. If that's not globalization gone mad, tell me what is.
I once bought a VHS, a camel handling VHS from a guy in Australia.
Oh, really?
He was you could go on a course with him. Marcus G, he was called, with a giant Abrahamic beard, and he would teach camel handling skills. And at the end of it, you could keep your camel because they had such a surplus. And I could never convince anyone in Australia, if I went on this course, to take the camel for me afterwards.
That's really funny. I don't talk about it in the Sahara, actually. I've got a son who is 8 years of age, and it's funny when another generation comes along, I think more about my own past, and I really think I should write. I'm sort of honor bound to write a book about my own time traveling in the desert and the experiences I had living in the desert and with the Bedu and on my own and everything else. But as I do, one of the things that I remember most fondly, perhaps, is that I used to own camels of my own and walk for extended periods of time on my own with my camels in the Sahara. And eventually I moved to Cairo. I take a job teaching at the American University in Cairo. And people ask me, what do you do with your camels? And I said, well, you've got to sell them, obviously. You don't need a camel in a fifth floor apartment in downtown Cairo. It's just not, it's surplus to requirements. But it's one of my proudest boasts is that I never lost money on the resale of a camel.
Mm.
So, often when I'm being introduced, it is that fact that I never lost money on a secondhand camel. It's very proud.
Well, I'd like to come back to your own travels as well, but we made a vast digression ahead. So let's jump back for a second to the wet period. So the only permanent rivers in the Sahara today are on the edges, like the Nile and the Niger, and they drain watersheds that are far beyond the desert. But even a cursory glance at Google Earth reveals vast webs of dried riverbeds and wadis. So paint us a picture of the sort of Sahara we could never imagine today.
Yeah. Imagine the Sahara before it looked like the Sahara, and you have to come up with another name. By accident, shall we say, I often refer to the Sahara Desert, but in Arabic, the word Sahara means desert. So to talk about Sahara is tautological or redundant. So before there was a desert, it was wet. If you don't mind, I'll go back even further. Before it was wet country, it was ocean. And I talk about this in the book too. And we have evidence of that because there are super croc is what it was nicknamed, but there are whale bones, essentially proto whales in the desert, not 80 kilometers southwest of Cairo. So right there, you have these enormous evidence of these marine creatures that lived in the area that today is Sahara. The whole continent of Africa only emerges in its present outline about 1.8 million years ago. So, okay, it's a long time ago. But before that 1.8 million, there was ocean over the majority of what's the Sahara today. So let's go forward a bit in time. The whole of what we think of as the Sahara today was once covered by vast forests. and forests of antiquity that lasted for thousands and thousands of years. And anybody who struggles to picture that now, you only have to think about the enormous reserves of oil and gas that you find in certain North African countries. And that the oil and gas are, it's carbon based, and it's all the evidence you want for vast forests covering the area, particularly in Libya and Algeria, where the oil and gas is most accessible today. So then when the forests recede, you have a wet period with humans. Okay, so you had human populations spread throughout the desert. Nobody knows with any certainty what size those populations were, but as is the case with the rest of life on Earth at the time, the human populations must have been very slight and perhaps didn't have, in the early days at least, much connection with each other. It's only when the desert starts to recede more and more, the desert starts to advance and the wetlands recede more and more, that the wet places, the oases, become so much more important. And then suddenly these are stepping stones to allow you to travel hundreds of miles by going from one source of water to the next. And a lot of that history is recorded in the rock art that we've already mentioned. And also in mythology that's kept in the collective imagination among desert peoples.
I've encountered traces of both of these things. I remember seeing fossilized wood out on the Salima sand sheet in northern Sudan, just randomly, and also came across the skeletons of several, I think they were catfish, large catfish. This was in the Borku region of northern Chad, like kind of where the white dusty bed of Lake Mega Chad blends into the dunes. Up around that bit, you can see a few of them just poking out of the ground there. Fossilized cat.
It's amazing, isn't it? It's amazing to think of this having a life before. Look out your window wherever you are in the world today, and if you're in a major city, you can imagine, okay, New York was once smaller than this, or London was smellier than this. But to go back into sort of prehistory, before we have written history, it's sometimes a bit of a struggle to imagine what life must have been like, particularly then when you come across this fossilized evidence, as you say, of forests, of fossilized wood, or catfish in the Sahara. It's a nice image.
What always surprised me was how widespread human populations were there, like the prevalence of stone tools and bits and pieces of ceramic were absolutely everywhere. I spent a month in Jebel Ouenat in northern Sudan, and also the Tibesti in Chad with another month at a separate trip with a guy who was cataloging some of this prehistoric rock art. And we would find on one of those, on an average trip, we would find maybe 3 grinding stones, perfect grinding stones from somebody. We found a complete kitchen once, just randomly, of multiple grinding stones and shattered pieces of ceramic pots and then flakes of stone tools, just scattered absolutely everywhere out there.
Yeah. No, it's remarkable. Yeah. And I think it's because it's so desiccated and dry and seemingly lifeless today that we struggle to think about it as anything else. But of course, journeys between these places, if you go back 2,000-3,000 years, were far less arduous before it was all hot desert. So, you can imagine the in-laws moving to the next oasis. But between the oasis, if there was water that ran along these wadis, if they had a means of collection, if you could grow, if you had any form of agriculture at all, populations could be supported across vast areas of the desert.
You mentioned as well how modern some of this stuff looks, some of the rock art. Like the majority of what we saw were cows. I got so tired of looking at cattle, to be honest, but there were a few panels. I remember one in Chad. We were in a really remote corner of the Tibesti. I think one Italian guy had made it there several years before. We had some notes of his, and that was about it. And there was one particular panel that looked like some sort of a feast or something, or a party, but it had the characters in this thing had such individuality. Like you could see a guy look like he's tripping over the fire, and this guy obviously had too much to drink over here. And you can imagine, a scene of revelry or something where these people are telling stories. And it reminded me of something that Matisse would paint, very, very modern looking. You would never tell.
It's interesting you say that. 2 things I would say. One, Matisse said he was inspired by what he found in his travels in North Africa. So there you go. It's all the evidence you need. It was right there in his notebooks. And the second thing to say is that if you come across an area particularly rich in rock art, It's worth remembering that single stone canvas might have been used over a period of some centuries. A bit like you can imagine people in Europe in the Middle Ages having a canvas and painting over it. And then they say, I don't like that, or they've got another commission but haven't got the money for another canvas, you paint over it. So you have these layers. It's a big word that I like to use sometimes is palimpsest, which means this layering of story upon story. And I think of the Sahara like that, very much literally and metaphorically, that you have these stone canvases where you see the cattle, as you say, too many cattle sometimes, and then you have a later phase appearing alongside. I mentioned earlier it's very difficult to date rock art, and I think that's one of the reasons, is that sometimes it's a bit of a jumble, which confuses the reality that these prehistoric artists were working there over a period of centuries. And you also see the development of technologies. So pretty much as soon as camels arrive in the deserts of North Africa, they are used as animals of war. So as soon as you got camels, people learn to mount them, and then they ride into battle on them. I mean, pretty much immediately. But you see this development in the rock art too, with saddles. And you can see saddles either behind the hump or in front of the hump, depending on the local way of doing business. You can see the length or shortness of swords and spears changing over time. And all of that comes across very clearly in the rock art, which again is another reason I don't like to think of it as primitive, because there is so much life in the rock art. The artists then did capture a lot of detail, more than I think many people would give credit for. Of course, there were more primitive phases. The original artwork perhaps is lacking in certain detail. But over time, it's remarkable. And also the carvings. I don't know if you encountered any rock carvings, but, almost life-size carvings of giraffe, which, when you think about how many hours there must have been spent by the artist or group of artists working on this, carvings of gazelle asleep as well. So not just here's the gazelle I shot, but here's a gazelle at repose, at rest. There is a creative urge, I think, in this artwork that belies a simple recording of a hunt. There's a lot more going on there.
Another thing that's I found quite interesting too in this traveling in that region was we would encounter these stone circles in the vicinity of Awaynat and towards the not on the sand sheet itself, but in any place where there was a slight hump or a hill and some rocks that clustered together, and we would often find pottery, bits and pieces of pottery within them. Would this have been at a time when the desert was advancing? And I kind of pictured pastoralists clustering into any sort of little hillside and either walling in their animals or walling out their enemies. I mean, what?
Yeah, I think it was more for walling animals in. I think you're right, to save them wandering off. The pots, though, it's remarkable how many remnants of pot there are across the desert too. Again, you picked up on a really interesting point. Some of them in the 20th century, of course. So people traveling might leave deposits of pots filled with water behind, so they knew they can make the return journey. And that's really interesting. A sort of way stations, or imagine coaching inns in the early days of the American West, where you would have these stops so the Pony Express know they could make their journey at top speed. Well, people in the Sahara did just the same thing by leaving deposits or caches of pots behind them filled with water. And they were used even actually up to the Second World War. I mean, there's stories of, I'm sure some of your listeners have heard of The English Patient, have seen the film of The English Patient, even if they've not read the novel, which is a brilliant novel. But it's based on a story about this Hungarian explorer called Count Laszlo Almásy. And he was employed by the Germans during the Second World War, Hungary being an occupied country. And he led at least one mission, to drop a couple of German agents on the banks of the River Nile. But he made use of his pre-war 1930s knowledge when he and British and American and other European counterparts were wandering the desert and leaving caches of water behind, so they knew they could revisit those places.
That's another era of the desert I'd like to come to as well, because it was these stories that inspired me to go to these same places. But let's jump back slightly to an earlier period of civilization. I'm thinking about some of the early empires. This might surprise listeners as well. The vast, I don't know if you'd call them states, but conglomerates of peoples that lived in these seemingly arid regions or seemingly lifeless regions. So tell me about the Garamantes.
Yeah, I can't remember the day I first heard about them, but I remember thinking, how have I not heard about these people before? We all know who the Greeks were, the Romans, the Egyptians, maybe even the Sumerians and the Assyrians. But then you hit a name like Garamantes and you see a map of their range. And I wouldn't say the area they controlled, but the range where they operated across the Sahara. And it's enormous. It's basically a similar territory to the US Midwest. And you think, wait a minute, how have I never heard of these people? Well, they didn't leave much in the way of written records behind, for one thing. But the Garamantes roamed pretty freely across much of northern and central Sahara, around modern-day Libya, certainly in Algeria. And even the mighty Roman Empire, when they get to North Africa, are confronted by these people, what the Romans would have characterized as savages in the desert. They really only call them savages because they wouldn't lie down and agree to be defeated by the Romans, but actually went at the Romans. And the Romans built these enormous sort of sand berms or walls to keep them out, basically as points where anybody coming out of the desert could be checked and maybe made to pay taxes if they were hoping to trade. But the Garamantes had this desert. You're right to hesitate. I think empire would be too strong a term for it. But they were a people, a civilization that existed in the Sahara. And really, they were only able to exist and cover the range they did because they both covered the trade routes in the Sahara and as a consequence had a large slave population. And they used the slaves to dig, to tap into those aquifers we've already discussed. So in digging down, say, 100 meters, they were able to bring up water from long way below the surface of the desert, and thus, have quite an advanced agricultural system in place, and not just in the oases that we find today, but you'll find evidence of large towns. I mean, even the Garamantes capital now in ruins in the desert today, but evidence clearly of they had a civilization that was able to support a large population, which maybe was in Colonel Gaddafi's mind when he had the great man-made river project to the fore.
So you said that was the first time in history that a non-riverine area of the Sahara produced an urban society.
Yeah, it's quite. It's not a controversial claim, but it's a surprising one, I think, to people who, again, when you say Sahara and you see desert, you imagine it to be just vast, endless dunes and nothing else. These weren't areas of massive sand dunes, but more the limestone plains that I mentioned at the start, which cover most of the desert. And clearly they were well organized. I mean, you don't develop a society like that where there's no running river without a great deal of organization, a great deal of technical know-how. Yes, they relied on slave labor to do a lot of the hard work, the hard digging, but also a technical and engineering know-how to both get water up from under the ground, storage systems. They had ways of keeping it cool by keeping it covered. I don't know if you've been to Petra.
Yes, yeah.
In Jordan. Well, there, the civilization, the Nabateans, I think, are much better known to Western audiences anyway, because of Petra. The Nabateans also, of course, had their range over parts of modern-day Saudi Arabia. But they're sort of an equivalent to the Garamantes in their ability to move water across very hot places. And also, they had much more advanced ways of keeping it sheltered from the sun. I mean, which Gaddafi, a lesson Gaddafi didn't take to heart.
So what finally did them in? Was it because they became a thorn in the side of the Romans?
History doesn't record accurately what became of the Garamantes. One theory is that they went too far in their diggings and it collapsed. That the Romans, another part of the theory is that the Romans kept them out of the Roman Empire, so they lost tax revenue of their own. When confronted with being trapped, if you like, or limited to the desert. They didn't have the same range for either conquest or trade that they had previously. And so, being a somewhat advanced, structured society, they simply ran out of money and couldn't continue expanding. So instead of expanding, imploded in on itself.
So you mentioned the incredible network of Sahara trade routes. Like, how did the salt trade connect the Mediterranean and sub-Saharan Africa?
This is one of the most amazing stories. I know lots of people like perhaps a diamond ring on their finger, but salt, is the only mineral that humans need to survive. And so there's a great book, wasn't there, written by Mark Kurlansky some years ago called Salt, and it's sort of history of salt. And it's well worth a read to anybody who's not familiar with it. So in Saharan terms, there was, I suppose, the most remarkable person we should highlight is a guy called Mansa Musa. And if those names aren't familiar, just think of Musa as the Arabic for Moses, and Mansa was a word for king or emperor in the Empire of Mali. It didn't cover, strictly speaking, the modern nation state of Mali, but a much bigger area in the Sahara. And in the 14th century, we're talking about, Mansa Musa lives in the first half of the 14th century, 1300s. And his empire sits atop enormous reserves of both salt and gold, and of course controls the trade routes across the Sahara. And it's from the salt mines of the Empire of Mali. Timbuktu is the most obvious place for modern audiences to have in mind. So from that part of the desert, enormous caravans of salt go not just north to the Mediterranean and all the Mediterranean cultures, north and south, but also they go from Timbuktu south to the Bight of Africa, to West Africa. So Eastern Hemisphere, yes, but it covered a great deal of it. If any of us know the name Timbuktu at all, again, a bit like Sahara, it's a sort of Timbuktu is more semi-legendary. And this is largely because in the 1320s, Mansa Musa decides to go on a pilgrimage. Being a good Muslim ruler, he makes the pilgrimage or Hajj to Mecca in modern country of Saudi Arabia. And his chroniclers say that he took 60 camels just to carry gold on this trip. He spent so much when he gets to Egypt that he devalued the currency of the entire North Africa, Middle East region for a decade. Now, I don't really do contemporary, but the idea of one person wrecking the economy for a decade is, draw your own political line of argument there. But it was because of Mansa Musa and his spending that this word Timbuktu starts filtering out to Europe. And so it's sort of an encouragement in the centuries that follow to Europeans to go into the Sahara to search for this place, Timbuktu, this El Dorado of the desert, if you like. Unfortunately, by the time the first Western European explorers get down there and find it and get home alive again to tell the tale, there's no gold left at all. And in fact, the earliest guy to get back, a Frenchman by the name of René Calais, when he gets back to France, and tells the story about Timbuktu being a dusty non-entity of an oasis, nobody believes him. So just they can't believe it. The legends of Timbuktu as a land where gold lines the streets are so strong in the European imagination that he's just disbelieved. And it drives, though, on a less humorous note, it does drive European exploration of the Sahara and arguably the colonization of North Africa by the Europeans.
It's funny how it's also become a metaphor for the farthest possible place. Like, it's just percolated down into the language. I remember as a little kid, we'd be on a road trip or something, and my mother would say, like, "Where the hell are we going? Timbuktu?" She'd never heard of this place. I don't even think she knows it's a real place.
Yeah, it's funny. I have the same memory as a child, although, growing up in England, we didn't have the enormous distances to cover by road. But I remember a cartoon comic of the Pink Panther. And for whatever reason, it jumps out at me. There's the Pink Panther looking at a sign and it says, "This way to Timbuktu." And again, the cartoonist is using it as the furthest place you can go on Earth, the remotest place on Earth. And yet, not 15 years ago, there was a lot of trouble in Mali and an attempt by certain parts of the country there to break away. And you might remember there was a lot of fear at the time for the scrolls and books that are kept in Timbuktu because of Mansa Musa and his empire more broadly. There's an awful lot of Arabic literature down there that was collected and copied over the centuries. So that Timbuktu, far from being a remote, desolate place that the Europeans found, was once the most important center of learning in the whole of West Africa. It would, what we might today call universities. Okay, maybe the term is a little grand, but scholars came from right across North and West Africa to Timbuktu because they had money, because they invested in education and learning and scholarship. And as a consequence, although the United Nations cultural branch, UNESCO, are still busy cataloguing this stuff, there are thousands of scrolls down there that have yet to be interpreted or understood or even catalogued. And there's a great deal of knowledge there that comes from ancient Greece and ancient Egypt via the translation movement in the Arab Middle Ages that still we don't know quite what treasures are waiting to be discovered. Perhaps, who knows, even texts from ancient Greece that exist nowhere else but in a scroll in Timbuktu. And that's not a stretch of the imagination. It's quite plausible that is the case.
There was a film a few years ago, wasn't there, about a documentary about this library and the man who was trying to preserve these?
There was indeed. And when they had the trouble, a lot of those people entrusted with the protection or preservation of these scrolls buried them underground so that they couldn't be destroyed or taken off by looters. And there was a book written about this. I think it was called something along the lines of The Badass Librarians of Timbuktu.
Yeah, it's something like this. Something about the librarians of Timbuktu, yeah.
Yeah. It's a fascinating story and one worth exploring further.
Well, I think it would astonish people to know just how central and important some of these places were. Like there were entire cities founded on salt. It was such an important commodity. So the camel, how did the arrival of the camel change the Sahara? Like you said, that it shifted some of the balance of power from north to south and spread ideas as well as trade goods.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the thing to say is when we are talking about the Sahara now, so we're firmly in desert times. So there was desert before there was camels. So then you get the camels arriving and human population centers are restricted to those places with water, as we've already discussed, the oases and the roads or the paths that go between one oasis and the next. So with the arrival of the camel, it means that you can now travel these enormous distances overland from major trading ports on the north coast, the Mediterranean. Think of Alexandria, any number of places along Tripoli, Algiers. You can go due south then, if you have protection in the desert. It's quite late. I know that everybody thinks of the Middle East as being a Muslim countries with Arabic as the predominant language, all of which is true. But it's only in the 7th century, so 639 is the precise year, when an Arab army invades North Africa. So before that year, 639, it wasn't Arab at all. The indigenous population, which are known as the Amazigh, or in more popular terms, the Berbers, a term which the Romans invented actually, Berber, meaning barbarian. So you can see why the locals aren't too keen on it, but prefer their own word, Amazigh. Only after the Arabs invade, obviously, does Islam arrive, because it's just at the time of the dawn of Islam. Islam's main prophet, Muhammad, has died just in the decade before that. And so the camel allows the spread of this new faith across North Africa over a period of some decades. And then as the Islamic civilization grows in places like Damascus and then later in Baghdad, and we have this famous period of global learning called the Islamic Golden Age, where both Greek wisdom and Egyptian wisdom is preserved and built upon, but also original indigenous Arab and Persian knowledge is allowed to grow. These ideas then spread right across North and West Africa thanks to the camel. So it would be impossible to quantify how it changed human culture and societies, because it was so deep and so broad and went on for so long, that if it hadn't been for the camel, who knows, maybe these ideas would have been restricted to traveling coastal routes.
Because before that point, the major wealth was collected, apart from these empires that we're talking about, the major trading wealth and the major connections to the rest of the world for the Sahara were on these northern coasts, right? Like this is where you get Carthage and the Roman settlements.
Absolutely, and movement between them would have been along the coast, so much safer to get in a ship. I mean, even Mediterranean storms notwithstanding, you would get in a ship in Algiers or Oran in modern day Algeria, and travel east to Carthage or travel further east to Alexandria, the capital of Greek-controlled Egypt for hundreds of years. That's something else people forget. I think that Alexandria was the capital of Egypt for hundreds of years and was an entirely Greek-speaking place, really. I mean, Egyptian as we think of it today, whether Arabic hadn't arrived till the 7th century, but the earlier languages of Egypt is still used by Copts, which is the indigenous Christian population of Egypt. But otherwise, it was Greek. Yeah.
How important is the camel to the Sahara today still in terms of its economy?
It's an interesting question. I don't think very would be the short answer. I think it's important in those parts of North Africa where foreign visitors come in terms of tourism. I mean, you go to any part of North Africa, the first thing you want to do is get on the camel, right? I mean, as a tourist, even if it's just having your photograph taken by the pyramids or in Marrakesh in Morocco. It's clearly an important source of food to people who are living in the desert itself. But, most of the nomadic populations have long gone. I mean, most of the native indigenous peoples of North Africa are settled peoples now. So, yeah, you still have camel farmers, camel herders, of course, like you do goat herders and shepherds. But it's not a major source of income anymore. That's gone by the wayside. It's really kind of crazy foreigners like me who make bigger thing of it. In fact, when I was looking for a guide initially, I was living with the Bedou in Egypt, and I was discussing with them how many days to this well that I'd found on a map, or how many days to this place, and they said, "What do you mean days? You can do it in 6 hours, but in a Toyota." And I was like, "No, but if you didn't take a Toyota," they said, "I don't know, we never tried. Why would we? We've got cars now." So a lot of that, the knowledge of navigation in the desert too, has been lost, which is fine. I mean, call it progress, call it inevitable. It's just one of those things. We've moved on.
So the trade now would be more for meat then? That you reminded me. I saw vast herds of camels on the move in Chad. It would have been around like maybe 30 kilometers south of Faya, the oasis. And I think they were coming from the Enedi and across and up the western side of the Tibesti to go to Libya.
Yeah.
We had just stopped in the middle of nowhere for a break, and we saw this dust cloud emerge on the horizon, and a huge, there must have been 200 camels clustered together and about 6 guys herding them. And they passed very slowly, and we stood there watching them pass in the distance. And just as they vanished into the distance, another one emerged from the desert. And this went on for nearly an hour. I think there must have been 6 of these herds in all, so about 1,000 animals.
Yeah. Yeah, that's meat. That is meat on the hoof or on the pad in the case of a camel. The most famous trade route across the Sahara today, or I should say in recent history, is called the Darb al-Arba'in, or 40-day road.
Yes, yeah.
And it was 40 days it was said to take from Sudan up, following the deserts to the west of the Nile, up to the major population centers. Of course, Cairo being the biggest population center in the whole of Africa, actually, not just the whole of North Africa, but right across the desert. Yeah, the shortest, safest route from Sudan, Chad to the north are still used for the transport of these animals. And it is for me. I mean, one of the camels I sold went on to be the meal of honor at somebody's wedding, for instance. So yeah, they're tasty too.
So you mentioned the 40-day road. This was a slave route, wasn't it? From roughly Darfur up into Egypt?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. A slave route. I suppose more disingenuously, people just call it a trade route, but the trade was in human beings and camels and other goods and services. Fabric, fabric was a very widely traded, perhaps less controversial material than human souls. But, if you're exchanging one set of goods in one direction, you need something else to go in the other. And trade in cotton, for instance, was not unimportant, but also salt as well. But yeah, the 40-day road was certainly one of the most important routes. And I think one of the last that had a real importance economically for the eastern part of the Sahara, at least, that it was. I mean, it is still used today, but not nearly as much. I mean, you see camels now far more on the back of trucks or Toyota, 3 camels in the back being driven up major highways along the Nile rather than walking. It's easier and it's cheaper,
They do look quite ridiculous in the back of a truck too, don't they? they back the truck up and shove them in, and they kind of collapse and fold into the back and just sit there looking around placidly.
They typically walk them up, on the back of a sort of a Toyota or some other. They walk them up and then make it sit down, and the next one comes up. And I know camels have a very bad reputation for being ornery or grumpy beasts, but frankly, if I was being manhandled into the back of a Toyota and strapped down, I'd be pretty annoyed too.
So we've talked about, you've mentioned travelers, and the desert seems to attract a certain type of traveler, going back even to ancient times. One of the most interesting I find is Ibn Battuta. So tell us who he was and how did he add to our knowledge of the Sahara?
Ibn Battuta is a wonderful character, and I feel sorry for anybody that's never come across Ibn Battuta or his works. He's one of the most important travelers and chroniclers for the whole sort of medieval period of history. He was almost an exact contemporary of Marco Polo. So Marco Polo is heading east to China, and we know that Polo and other members of his family went as far as China. What we're less certain of is how much truth there was in many of his stories. Now, Ibn Battuta has likewise been accused of making stuff up. But more often than not, Battuta says, this was reported to me, or I'm not sure I believe this, but this is what I was told. And his travels go potentially as far as China, but certainly right across North Africa, down to Timbuktu, right across the Middle East more broadly, the Arabian Peninsula. Like a good Muslim, again, he did the Hajj pilgrimage. But Ibn Battuta is one of the few sources from this period that we're talking about now who covered both North Africa, Middle East, coastal India rather than inland, parts of Central Asia, and his journeys took decades. He's from Morocco. He comes back to Morocco to find that most of his family, his parents, have died in an outbreak of the Black Death. When he finds out this news, he decides to set off on the road again and goes off for another decade exploring. A remarkable character whose name, by the way, Ibn means son of, and Battuta means duckling. Why he was called the son of a duckling, history doesn't record. But he's a lovely writer, very engaging. He dictated all of his travels later in life. So again, I'm prepared to forgive the occasional infelicity of memory, because these things were dictated sometimes decades after his journeys. He talks quite openly too about when he's not happy. He goes to Timbuktu, and by this stage, it's again not the great empire it once was, and he complains that he isn't treated royally enough, that he's not given gifts that are commensurate with his, or he sees his position in society to be. So he's a little bit gossipy too, which is often how we get some really interesting insights to times in history.
You mentioned on that journey, he wrote about a blind guide. That was quite amazing.
Yeah, again, do we trust every word of this or not? It's difficult to say, but yeah, the story goes that there is a guide in the Sahara who finds his way by smell largely, and memory and sound. It's not quite as much of a stretch as you might think. And in fact, my wife was based in Rwanda for 3 years, in a remote part of northwestern Rwanda near the border with Congo. And she remembers coming across somebody there, a European who was traveling around the world. And he said he was cycling around the world. And he said he could smell a change of country. And this is somebody who's fully sighted, traveling in the modern world. And I think part of it is being attuned to your environment. So I don't think it's an enormous stretch of the imagination to imagine a guide being able to navigate over time and space without sight. Again, unlike Toyota drivers today, if you are used to walking alongside a camel, you know exactly what speed you're traveling at. And if you've done a journey by dead reckoning and it's taken you 10 hours to get to well X, then you know the next time you do it, if you've been walking for 9.5 hours, you can say it's just around the next corner. I mean, people will remember that. It's like your muscle memory. If anybody's into running and you have your certain routes, you know how far along your route you are, or your journey to work on an underground train even. You know, oh, I've been reading for 10 pages. I'm just around the corner from work. And this is with modern technology. So Batuta was impressed by him, certainly.
So you mentioned later travelers and sort of the rush of European travelers into this region. It's amazing how recently this was all a blank space on the map. You say that centuries before the fall of the Bornu Empire, Europe is still almost wholly ignorant of the Saharan interior, which was a source of embarrassment for those living in and after the Enlightenment. So the answer was this: to go to a pub and found a learned society, which sparked exploration into these areas. The Africa Association was formed.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? The number of ideas that youngish people, perhaps especially young men, have had in pubs that seemed like a really great idea at the time.
Well, there's a German phrase. The German word for that is Schnapsidee, an idea you come up with while drinking.
That's great. I love it. The Germans have so many wonderful words, don't they? It was an embarrassment to Europeans, frankly, that they knew that there was this big landmass of North Africa, the Sahara, and they knew they didn't know anything about it. It's referenced, of course, in ancient texts, the Egyptians perhaps most famously being part of it, but then the Greeks and the Romans. And so, yeah, it was a source of embarrassment that they were meant to be so learned, and in a post-Enlightenment world, we didn't know anything about it. And so the African Association is formed at the end of the 18th century, 1790, in a pub or coffee house in Soho, in London, that is. And they say, we'll have these geographical missionaries and we'll send them off to go and explore and map it. I mean, it shows the level of ignorance that if you can picture the Sahara or North Africa in your head, that they thought the best place to go and find Timbuktu was to set off from Cairo, as opposed to dropping somebody on the west coast of Africa. Remarkable. And in fact, the first person they sent off was an interesting character called John Ledyard, who is not terribly well known. He was a college dropout. I don't know, somebody's yet to write the history of college dropouts and what they achieved, but he was at Dartmouth College and dropped out and cut down a tree, made a canoe, took it down the Connecticut River, and he makes his way. He had some remarkable journeys around the world, but he arrives in Cairo to go off in search of Timbuktu and dies in Cairo. Marley is buried there. But just a couple of generations later, the African Association morphs. It's renamed the Royal Geographical Society, which of course still exists today. And they put up the prize money for the first person to discover the source of the Nile, the source of the Niger River. And it was a work of many, many people, and lots of people who never came back, of course. These were harsh lands across which to travel, and dangerous. I mean, obviously, European travelers weren't necessarily welcome among the people there, and people who relied on banditry for their living didn't really care two hoots if they were killing a European, an African, or an Arab. It was all the same to them. So they might have scientific equipment, which probably didn't get them any money because they didn't know what this stuff was, at least at first glance. So it was really dangerous, but I think an important, from the Europeans' perspective, an important mission to try and, in inverted commas, civilize the world and increase their knowledge. And the more they discovered, I think the more this knowledge fed into ideas of superiority, of European superiority over the locals. And it certainly does inform, I mean, a lot of what Edward Said writes about in his book Orientalism, about non-innocent travelers. I think sometimes his arguments go too far. I think there were lots of, if I can say, innocent travelers, those that were really just interested in going to foreign parts and not having imperial conquest in mind. But on the other hand, there were plenty that did, and they came from Britain, they came from Italy and Germany and France and just about everywhere else in Western Europe and North America. And they did have an impact on the history of the region that led to European conquest of virtually every corner of North Africa. So yeah, it wasn't all entirely innocent, this exploration, by any means.
It also surprises me that in encountering these kinds of places, the knee-jerk reaction would be a feeling of superiority. I've usually found it's a humbling experience to travel in these places with people who understand the landscape and how to travel there, and to realize, I couldn't navigate this place on my own, and I have no clue how they know these things.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? That encounter, you're confronted with two things. One, your perhaps reliance on local guides to navigate and for your survival in the desert, because they know where the water is and you don't. But on the other hand, the Europeans brought with them at the time superior technology. So we had the guns. And I think this encounter between East and West that starts, not exactly, but let's say with Napoleon invading Egypt in 1798, it opens up a lot of the North Africa and the broader Middle East to an encounter with what was then European modernity, and not just political ideas about the Enlightenment and all the Enlightenment writers, but technology like guns. And there's nothing that can drive conquest more than having superior weapons. And on the other side, then, the populations of North Africa, as great as they might have seen themselves, they started to have this crisis of identity. Well, if we are the chosen of God as Muslims, why is he, if you want to put a gender attribute on God, why is he letting us down? These Europeans have got this superior weaponry. They've got modern medicine. They've got modern learning. They seem to know so much more than us. And it's interesting because it provokes a sort of revival of looking at inward. So to say, well, perhaps we've strayed from the true path. So at this time, you do find a lot of Muslim reformers emerging who say in their encounter with the West, if they've beaten us today, it's because we've strayed from the path. So we need to look back to the earlier, more purer times of Islam, perhaps. And I know it seems like a bit of a digression when we're talking about the Sahara, but it's not unimportant for a lot of what's seen as more small c conservative forms of Islam in remoter parts of Middle East and North Africa. It comes about because of this encounter with the Europeans from the late 18th century onwards.
So much of this this colonization took place after the Ottoman Empire became increasingly weak and started to dissolve and created this power vacuum in the northern coast. But why were the French so interested in controlling so much of what would seem to be desert wasteland?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I mean, I think the first thing to say is just to circle back very, very briefly to Napoleon invading Egypt in 1798. Napoleon says that Europe is too small to build a reputation. Only in the Orient, as he calls it, could one make a name for oneself. Well, of course, picture a world map. Between Europe and after Egypt, you've got India. All right. So this was Britain's great interest. So the French were interested because the British were already there. I think this is, there's got to be a point about annoying the British or blocking British trade in the Eastern Mediterranean. In North Africa, then, it comes to Napoleon too, after his death. So the French invade Algeria in 1830. And the source of this dispute was a loan that Napoleon had made during his campaigns in Italy, of all places. He came up with that expression that an army marches on its stomach. So in order to feed his soldiers in Italy, he'd bought grain from merchants in Algeria. The debt goes unpaid. The merchants get upset. There is a slap in the face of the French consul in Algiers, and this is used as a cause for the invasion. It also should be noted that the French invade Algeria in an election year. So the idea that you have a foreign war because you might lose an election is, of course, as far from our imagination as it's possible to be. The British then, their response was, let the Gallic cock scratch in the sand, because the British didn't see anything of value there. The British were very happy, though, to keep control after the 1880s of Egypt and the Nile and the routes to India. And so basically just allowed the French free rein in those parts of Northwest Africa that made up an enormous French empire. And of course led to the French Foreign Legion being founded, and all the sort of beau geste type stories and adventures that we think of in the Sahara. I mean, I think we should also say that the French didn't control the whole of this area. They had a presence there, or a force there, but these remote desert forts were subject to attack by local groups that objected to their presence. It's not as though the French had full control over the whole of the territory they like to control. And even if you look at maps from the 19th century, you think of Algeria today, well, the lines really in the 19th century maps only extend to, beyond the coast. They don't even claim to have control over what we'd think of today as southern Algeria or northern Niger or Mali, Mauritania. Those were remote and beyond their control, really.
It seems that many of these regions are beyond the control of their own governments today as well. If you think of the Tibesti and all the constant uprisings in these regions.
Yeah, if you think of, for one thing, they're remote. Okay. The second thing is the populations are quite small. So while it's not unimportant, the national borders, think about Algeria. Okay, if you drew a line around Algeria, its sea coast and the borders it shares, with the countries in North Africa, it's roughly the same in miles as the border between the US and Canada. So imagine just trying to police that in some place where you are a long way from water, where there aren't major settled populations. I think it's really easy to appreciate, just from a tactical viewpoint, why security is so difficult to maintain. It's remote, it's harsh, and there's not much there. So smugglers do often have free rein, whether they're smuggling people or cigarettes or white goods and pasta, all of which is smuggled across the Sahara. I have a degree of sympathy with local governments and local police forces and law and order, because it's even with technology and drones and motion sensors, think about the border between the US and Canada. It's a massive undertaking just to control that.
There were smuggling problems on the Canadian border just down the river from where I grew up on the St. Lawrence. There's a Mohawk reserve there, and there's an awful lot of cigarettes come across that border tax free.
There you go. There you go. Were they camels?
I don't know, actually. No, they're plain brown wrapping. No, nothing as classy as a camel on the label. I would have taken up smoking had I seen that. Probably, I'd be attracted to the image. I wanted to ask you about a couple other travelers from this period as well. Heinrich Barth caught my eye. I was surprised to learn that he's buried here in Berlin. I lived in that neighborhood. I'd been to that graveyard. I'd never encountered. Now I'm ashamed that I hadn't encountered his monument.
Well, now you got an excuse to go back. Yeah, Heinrich Barth is of all the European Victorian era explorers, 19th century, I should say more properly, he is often considered one of the most enlightened. And I slow down as I say those words, because he's enlightened by the standards of European explorers in the 19th century. So, he's certainly no bleeding heart liberal and seeing all men are equal sort of thing. But he did go to the effort of learning local languages. He did go to the effort, more than many of his contemporaries, of listening to locals. You made the point earlier about how you are humbled when you travel in parts of the world where you rely on locals for insight, advice, and indeed one's survival in the desert. And Barth was definitely much more on that end of the spectrum than the arrogant foreigner. His journeys were very impressive in and of themselves. I mean, over many years and many thousands of kilometers, he traveled very, very widely, but took the time during his travels to, as I said, learn the languages, take a more anthropological approach rather than one of a conquering hero. So he was genuinely interested in these peoples, and not just for what he might get out of it, But now even Bart has his blind spots, and rock art is a good example, because encountering some of this rock art in the desert, he writes somewhat pejoratively, or very pejoratively, I should say, that no barbarian could have carved these lines, i.e. meaning that the locals couldn't possibly have done this. And so he puts it down to the Phoenicians or Carthaginians, basically somebody that looked a bit whiter than the locals he was meeting today. You know, Eastern Mediterranean, olive skin was okay, but it was unlikely that the black Africans could have done it. Now, you know, who knows what the people looked like at the time that they were carving and painting the rock art. But it's just to highlight that, you know, we all of us are subject to the mores of our own time. And so Bart's view of what the locals were capable of was certainly colored by, you know, him being a person of a certain era.
The other traveler from this time period who really interests me is Hassan Bey. Tell us about him.
Yeah. Hassan Bey, interesting. You know, he was fortunate, if you like, that he was around at the time of the British occupation of Egypt. Fortunate insofar as he, although he was connected and came from the Egyptian elite, he was also able to attach himself to the British elite in Egypt at the time. There's a fabulous woman explorer, Rosita Forbes, who travels around the Egyptian and Libyan Sahara, and she writes her stories down and sort of sidelines Hassan Bey quite a bit. You know, you read her account, and you'd think that she was there on her own or with just some poor chap to light the fire and carry the bags. But actually, she wouldn't have been able to do any of her journeys had it not been for Hassan Bey's connections to the Egyptian royalty and the British authorities. And he's interesting too, I think, because too often the local explorers are overlooked. Okay, we've mentioned Ibn Battuta, but he wasn't an explorer so much as a traveler and a chronicler from the 14th century. But Hassan Bey is going out there doing things in his own right, as in the sort of mold of the modern European explorer, but through local eyes too. Now, of course, the elites in Egypt aren't the same as the peasant class of Egypt. Of course, their privilege has to be noted, but he was doing it out of an interest in the geography and history of, you know, his own country. And in fact, if I revisit the Sahara now, I would like to correct some oversights, if you like, from the first edition of this history of the Sahara I wrote, by including a lot more characters from the Middle East and North Africa who write about and who were inspired by the Sahara, whether it's musicians or filmmakers, or, I mean, even writers like the most famous, perhaps, Egyptian writer is a guy called Naguib Mahfouz, who was the first writer in Arabic to win the Nobel Prize in Literature. You know, and he has a lot more to write about it. But it was only after this book came out that my Arabic language improved sufficiently so that I was able to access more Arabic sources in the original. And I'd certainly look forward to republishing the Sahara, perhaps with a chapter just using the Arabic sources.
Yeah. So Hassan Bey made some remarkable camel journeys.
Yeah, he did.
Was he one of the last people to do such journeys? I mean, after this, we enter the era of the motor car.
Yes.
I think he overlapped the era of the motor car, didn't he? He did an expedition with tracked vehicles of some sort.
Yeah, early 20th century. He is there exactly at the dawn of the motor car. And I think it was understood quite early on that this new technology would eventually develop in such a way that the desert would be opened up to much greater speed. And I think even at the time of Rosita Forbes going out from, you know, as a well-to-do European woman, that their journeys in the Sahara were done with a sense of romance, a romance for a time that was about to pass. I think they were aware of this. Although the journeys were hard, don't get me wrong, I don't want to diminish their achievement or the strenuous efforts they went to. I mean, it's damned hard work crossing the deserts they crossed and the bits of the desert I touched on. It's exhausting and mentally tiring as much as physically. But I think there was definitely a romance for this is about to pass with the era of the motor car. If I could fast forward just a few years, the The guy that inspired me more than any other, perhaps in Saharan terms, was an English explorer called Ralph Bagnold, who he was the one who really opened up much of the Eastern Sahara, anyway, with the motor car in the 1920s and 30s. And he had Ford Model Ts. He was living in Egypt at the time, working for the Egyptian government, which, in brackets, British government in Egypt. And in his spare time, he would go off and explore with his buddies. They called themselves the International Sand Club. And it included Laszlo Almasy, who we mentioned earlier, becomes better known as the English patient in the novel by Michael Ondaatje. But Bagnold opened up the desert like nobody had before, and is even the originator of lots of the things that people driving in the desert still rely on today, such as the idea of letting a bit of air out of your tires so that you cover a bigger surface area, so it's easier to travel across soft surfaces. He developed the use of sand mats, so when you do get stuck, a bit like mud mats in North America in the mud season, you put something under the tire to get traction. Well, he did this in the desert. Also, the sun compass, a device which meant that you could drive for miles without having to get out of a car and walk away from the vehicle, because a regular compass, of course, is going to have its needle spinning like crazy being so close to the metal. So the sun compass allows for sort of dead reckoning over hundreds of miles. Bagnold was also remarkable for his, he established something called the Long Range Desert Group during the Second World War, which was a reconnaissance unit of the British Army that operated hundreds of miles sometimes behind enemy lines. But also, he studied and wrote a book called The Physics of Blown Sand, which is every bit as boring as it sounds.
I've tried to read this, yeah.
I too have failed. And I don't think it's entirely because I'm not a physicist, but it's just very hard going. But interestingly, Bagnold was so important that even in the 1960s, he's consulted by NASA as they're preparing to kind of try and land on the moon, because they realize that he probably knows more about how sand and dust and whatever else they thought they might find on the moon, how this moves around and under what conditions. So there you have a Saharan explorer from the pre-Second World War era being consulted by NASA, before the first footsteps on the moon. It's a lovely sort of circle.
He's an example of that brilliant tradition of the amateur explorer, amateur scientist contributing something of lasting worth. But I think there's a region of Mars named after Bagnold as well.
That's right.
Some feature of Mars.
There is.
That's my all-time. I think that's in my top 5 all-time favorite travel books, Libyan Sands.
Oh, I'm very pleased to hear it. Yeah.
I'm hoping to do an entire episode on Ralph Bagnold. I'm in contact with his son, but it's been very difficult to schedule.
Gosh, I don't know what age his son would be now, but that was the one book that inspired me more than any other in my early years. And then after that, at the same time, I was falling in love with Peter O'Toole, of course, in Lawrence of Arabia, which isn't Saharan, but even so, it stimulated my young mind. And then after that, it was Wilfred Thesiger. Mm-hmm. Again, his work mainly on the Arabian deserts of Arabia. But Bagnold was the first one for the Sahara that really captured me. And as he says, the fact is we were a little afraid of the desert. And when you see the picture of a little Ford Model T and a sand mat and hundreds of miles of sand in every direction, you can see why. They were incredibly brave. Maybe foolhardy is a better word. But yeah, great story.
Well, that's what inspired me to go to Waynat as well, to see traces of Bagnold's expeditions, Salima Oasis, and we found a fuel dump, the Jenna dump, that I think that was associated with the Kufra convoys. You could still feel the tracks of the convoys too, like as you're driving across the sand and you feel something tug the tires, and it's these tire tracks from those lorries.
Amazing.
Really amazing. So was it Thesiger that inspired you to choose to travel by camel?
Yes, it was. Yeah, most definitely. In fact, I was very fortunate to meet him. I wrote to him. At a time when you first had this idea to go to Egypt and buy camels and walk in the Sahara, you can imagine the sort of reaction that one's parents have. It's like you're crazy, and friends. It was just, I grew up in a very ordinary part of southern England and had no, to my knowledge, no explorers in the family or adventurers or even great travelers. So the idea that you would want to go off and do this, it was met with either blank looks or consternation. But I wrote to Thesiger and, got the most wonderful response, which was only full of encouragement and an invitation to come and meet in London. And yeah, he was the only person that thought it was a good idea. So he set me on that path.
So what was your impression of him?
Well, he was very elderly when I met him, very elderly. But the word that comes to mind, apart from the fact that I idolized his work and his writings, a little sad, constrained, I suppose. It was obvious he was coming to the end of his time on Earth. And when you think about the horizons he'd seen and the adventures he'd had, I think there was a degree of melancholy about him and my meeting with him that I wasn't perhaps expecting. Melancholy.
And your travels by camel were the western deserts of Egypt, mainly?
Correct. Yes. And on one of those trips, I should say that I didn't know nearly enough to do it on my own initially, but learned from the Bedou and spending time with them. And then also I was in touch with a charity called the Brook Hospital for Animals. I think now they've renamed themselves the Brook, Brooke. And that was set up by an English lady after the First World War, because the need for animals during the First World War was so great on the part of the various forces in the region that many animals were abandoned after the war, left to their fate. And she wrote letters to newspapers and started this charity basically to raise funds and take care of them. And so the Brook Hospital still operates in Egypt and Jordan and India and Pakistan, all places that she lived with her husband. He was in the British Army. And so I got to know some of the vets for the Brook Hospital and learnt about camel husbandry from them. And they went to the camel market with me for my first sort of introduction to that fine place just outside of Cairo. And I initially kind of did some walks with camels to raise money for the Brook Hospital. Yeah, that's how it started, really.
And why have you never written about this?
Do you know, it's a very good question. I think life got in the way. And I must, as I said earlier, now that I've got an 8, nearly 9-year-old son, Fergal, an Irish name that means man of courage, because I figured we could do with one or two. I feel it's incumbent on me to write it. Right now, I'm supposed to be finishing the writing up of a PhD in modern Middle East history. Since the Sahara came out, I've written 3 book-length lecture series for the great courses, who rebranded themselves Wondrium a year or two ago, on Middle Eastern history from the rise of Islam to basically up to the present day. And they were tremendous series to write, but it took years of work. I've got lots of other projects on either the back burner or not even on a burner yet, but ideas that rattle around my head. Working on some Arabic translation at the moment for my PhD. One of the most fun projects I have in mind is a one-man show, which has the working title Lawrence of Arabia and Me. And I do a lot of public lectures on the history of the Middle East. And also because Lawrence of Arabia is such an iconic figure and inspiration to many who from the West who encounter the Middle East for the first time, I kind of see an attempt to do a history of the Middle East and stories of my own times in the region as a sort of stand-up one-man show. So that's something else I'm working on.
Well, it's a good idea. I mean, we could use more accounts of camel travel by camel. Is there anybody today still doing any serious journeys by camel that you know of?
Not to my knowledge. I wouldn't be surprised if there's some young fools out there doing it, but I don't know who they are this time. I might even be tempted to do it myself again with my son and wife. Who knows?
Well, I think Michael Asher, I heard he was in the recent years anyway, running trips in Sudan from the Darfur, maybe not right now, but he was doing some sort of camel trips at the
heroic character, Michael Asher. Yeah.
Oh, The Impossible Journey is an incredible book.
Yeah. No, I've never met Michael, but I know his work and I loved his writing. Yeah, he was another inspiration to me, certainly.
Yeah, I've got several of his books here. I'd like to talk to him about about that first one, especially. Jesus, what an incredible journey. So you've mentioned, in closing, you've mentioned that a possible new edition of your cultural history of the Sahara.
Yeah,
I really hope you do put that together. I mean, there's so much in this book.
there is, and I haven't read it closely for probably a decade. I mean, I give a lot of public lectures to the organizations in Britain, such as the Art Society, where I focus on Islamic art and architecture and the sort of more cultural bits of the Sahara. But when I wrote it, my knowledge of Arabic wasn't that good, and it's a great deal better since. And I've read a lot more accounts by Arabic writers, poets, filmmakers, and I think it would be a lot better and more balanced if I was perhaps to introduce more of the indigenous writing on the Sahara. Also, before the book came out, I hadn't read my contract very closely, and the publisher required 80,000 words of me, and I wrote 130,000. And when I submitted it, I just got this email back saying, "Didn't you read the contract?" And I said, "No." So my wife and I were in Boston we had actually gone there for restaurant week. My wife was looking forward to dining out and going to all these great places. But I spent the week instead cutting 50,000 words from the Sahara. And I did write an article called "What's Missing from the Sahara" for the London magazine after publication. So I might resurrect some of that material too. Who knows?
Hey, it sounds like you got quite a lot to draw on.
Maybe two volumes in a slipcase. How about that?
I would buy it. I'll be first in line.
There's one copy.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Eamonn. This is really interesting. I mean, there's so much more we could go into here, but I hope listeners will pick up this book, and especially if you bring a new edition online, let me know about that.
I will, of course, Ryan, and thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure to talk with you about this. I mean, the Sahara is still one of the most amazing places on Earth, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it again. It's been some time since I spent any real time there, but it won't be too long before I head back, I'm sure.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Personal Landscapes. If you like the podcast, please give it a rating on iTunes and subscribe through your favorite app. You can find links to today's podcast and more conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. You'll also find a donate button if you'd like to contribute to the costs of the show. All donations are greatly appreciated.